Okay, well, we'll kick off with some basic introductions to us going. For those who don't know me, I'm Catherine Kent, and I chair the WORAN group. And my day job, I work as the Joint Head of Profession for Operational Research at the Office for National Statistics, part of the Government Operational Research Service. And we're pleased to welcome our speakers today, Ellen Lewis and Anne Stevens, who are co-directors of the Ethos of Engagement Consulting. And they're going to be here today to talk us through their approach to systems thinking and taking us through some practical examples of the work they've been doing across a range of different countries, covering a range of different systems thinking and other related techniques. You should know that we have Anne based in Australia, so that's great news. It's a very different time, so thank you very much for making the time to join us. If there's any connection issues, please bear with us because of the distance. So for those who this might be your first WORAN session, just a little bit of background about the group. We're a collection of not just women, but anyone who's got a passion for promoting women in OR, so doing OR or wanting to learn more about the types of work we do in OR and the impact it could have on women. We have a successful program of events. There's usually one every month, and our upcoming one in February is a leadership focus. And we have various connections and sponsors for WORAN, and obviously it's part of the overall OR society, but we welcome people to join us in WORAN who aren't necessarily members of the OR society. So because this session today is focused very much on systems thinking, I want to get a bit of a feel for your experience, both in terms of systems thinking and also just about your career, what part of your career you're at. So I'm hoping Karen will be able to, there we go, as if by magic, the poll appeared. So if we talk through the first poll, which is, do you use systems thinking in your work? So if you can just vote. Excellent. So on the first poll, we've had, I'm not sure if I can share results of the poll, whether people can see that live. I can, oh, others can see it live as well. Brilliant. So we've got exactly half of the people who use systems thinking occasionally, and then others that do it on a more frequent basis. Someone's put none of the above, so that's an interesting answer. So hopefully everyone will get something out of this session. I think that broadly fits with my personal reflections. So I know of system thinking, I use it when I can, but more examples and more practical experience of how I can use it in my work would be really beneficial. So really looking forward to this session. And in terms of what stage of people's career, we've got a lot of people who are around the mid to end, but we have one student with us, so welcome. That's, it's great to see students here as well, and hopefully everyone will get something out of the session today. So just before I pass over to Ellen and Anne, I did mention we've got some upcoming events. You can look at those on the OR Society website. I can give you a quick heads up. So the next one is on the 23rd of February at 2:30, so a slight diversion from our usual time of 1 p.m. About the challenges of becoming a leader. And on the 16th of March, we've got a book discussion, so slightly different format, where we're going to be talking about a book which is called The Sex Factor: How Women Made the West Rich. I'll be leading that session, and the book's by Dr. Victoria Bateman. It's not essential you read the book in advance, but it is available through all usual channels. So if you fancy getting a hold of that, we can have a more richer discussion then. Okay, without further ado then, I will ask Ellen to share her slides, and thank you very much. Fantastic. I can see your screen, Ellen, so go ahead.
Okay, so you can hear me and see my screen? Perfect. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ellen Lewis, and my colleague Ann Stevens is also on the line. Just a kind of a forewarning about our connectivity. Ann's connectivity is spotty at times, and so we've made an agreement that she will be mostly off camera, but she'll turn on her camera just so you can see her lovely face. But then she'll turn off her camera, and there is a slight possibility that she might lose connectivity altogether, but not to worry. I will carry on and we will do our presentation, and she will log back on when she can. So that's our current plan. So welcome. We're very thrilled to be here with you, and we're thrilled to share our work with you that we're completely passionate about and are so full of joy every day to work with, which you don't often get to say that, and we do get to say that. So it's really great. Hold on while I figure out how to, there we go. So we are Ethos of Engagement. We're a small consulting firm. We're values-based and women-owned. And we are based in around the world, and you'll see a little bit more about that. And basically, we prioritize advancing women, girls, and other marginalized voices. That's our goal and our value and our priority. To bring their rights by bringing them together in a diverse network. And that looks like we have different consultants that work with us, and we have different contractors that work with us, and we have different organizations that work with us from around the world. We work in many teams. We work in, most of our work is in monitoring and evaluation, but we also do a lot of capacity development, capacity building, so workshops and trainings. And we also do organizational work. And we're currently also engaged with a series of masters in systems thinking that are apprenticeships that are being rolled out in the UK. Our contributions to the inclusive sustainable society. So as we said, we're global. You can see that the red stars are where Anne and I live. I live in Portugal and she lives in Australia. Yellow is, those yellow crosses are where we are establishing regional leads. So we're working with a group of mid-career or early career professionals that not necessarily in systems thinking, but certainly as working for global development work in their own countries. And we're partnering with them to build their capacity to do their own monitoring and evaluation in their countries, and for us to learn from their perspective and their context. So we have two regional leads in Kenya, one in East Timor, and two in Colombia. The orange little cylinders that you see are generally places where we have done projects or are currently doing projects around the world. So what started all of this lovely work is in 2018, we published this guide with UN Women. It's called ISC for GEMS is the short name for it, acronym for it. And you can find it online. It's part of the UN Women publication website. You can find it in English and Spanish, and you can find it as a guide itself, but you can also download the tools that are in Word and adapt them for any project that you might be doing. We've used it in over 20 countries to evaluate a wide range of programs and projects in education, women's sexual health and reproductive rights, women and young people's leadership in agriculture, women's farmers' livelihoods and safe access to markets, the provision of early childhood education, and the prevention of violence against women. And as you can see, there's a common theme there. So also what some of the actual themes that we're working on, or actual projects, focus of projects, are into a range of social and environmental issues. And I'm not going to read these off to you, but you can see that in some way they are supporting marginalized voices, they're supporting women, they're supporting culture, they're supporting leadership. And we also have done work even in to a project that was really interesting to help save the great green macaw, which is this beautiful parrot, which there's only about 1,500 to 2,000 left of them in Central and South America. So there's a wide range of projects and of different skills that we use in these projects, not just monitoring and evaluation. So we don't take a siloed approach. Our interest is in broader and influenced by the philosophy grounded in systems thinking, which we'll come back to in a moment. Our interest really is in understanding the full context and root causes of these issues faced by people and what we call the intersections between gender, other dimensions of diversity, and ecological restoration and preservation. So for example, we looked at how environmental degradation may affect women's health where access to clean water is a problem for them. That required the intersection of age, gender, religion, and culture that may prevent young people who are not yet married accessing their reproductive rights, was another project. Or the intersections between male attitudes towards women and girls, policing, health and education systems as the driving influences, or points for the prevention of violence against women. So you can see it's a very diverse breadth of activities that we're involved in. And now I'll pass this up to slide 7 to Anne.
Thanks, Ellen. I hope everyone can hear me. I won't turn my video on because things seem stable, and I hope they're not my famous last words. Okay, so today's presentation, what Ellen and I really want to share more about with you is the value of inclusive systemic thinking. Now, this is the primary methodology or approach for all our work, whether it's evaluation or program design. What we will talk about are some of the key influences that helped us build those frameworks for IST, and also the GEMS framework, which we'll come to. And we would invite you to do some reflection on this, what systemic thinking might look like in your own work. So please know that you can ask any questions at any time, and we really welcome all thoughts, no matter how big or little it might be. So the background to all this sort of emulates with my own PhD work back in the late noughties, 2000 and noughties, whatever we call that decade. My own PhD was confirmed in 2012, but one of the products of it was a set of principles which I call the feminist systems thinking framework. So it was a mechanism for social analysis and evaluation research, and it really looked at what are the overlapping concepts here between feminism and critical systems thinking. So feminism is a very broad canon of work, as some people might be aware. So I've really narrowed it down to eco-feminist schools of thought because that contained my interest in environmental justice as well as justice for gender. And critical systems thinking because it seemed like the most appropriate school of thought for a constructivist and interpretivist framing that I was seeking to find. So what I did is I imbricated these in a process of grounded theory, and voila, these systems thinking principles emerged. And then fortunately, Ellen came along and read that work and went, I can use this. I can operationalize this. I can turn this into something more. And so what Ellen then did was work on the gendered systemic analysis, which was her own PhD work. And I'm going to throw back to you, Ellen, so you can explain a bit more about that.
So thank you. So yeah, so it was really exciting to find Anne's work just as I was beginning to start my research around my doctoral work, which was focused on gender and global development. And what I had found that I could use Anne's theoretical framework and actually create a method out of it. So I took her principles, her theoretical principles, and I did my fieldwork for 5 months in Nicaragua, Central America. I used many elements of FST, feminist systems thinking, and critical systems thinking in my research project. And I facilitated the consideration of issues of inclusion, exclusion, and marginalization by promoting and reflection on the boundary, on different boundaries. And what I did is I actually worked with a university in Nicaragua that was doing small business development in rural populations. So they already had an ongoing project where they were working with primarily agricultural small businesses, but small businesses in general, to get their businesses to be a little bit stronger, and to look at business plans and different. So they had this whole couple of months, 4 or 5 month program that they had people going through in different parts of Nicaragua. And so I just went along with them. Luckily, I was invited to. And I introduced the idea of using, doing a boundary critique, which is their small business, taking the elements of FST, which was gender, nature, and the voices from the margin, and doing an analysis of their business to see if there's any opportunity for them to strengthen areas around those 3 topics to create and drive social change. So what that led to is that that FST and the GSA work led to a concept that we thought of, that we named systemic thinking, but inclusive systemic thinking. And what systemic thinking shaped the way that we developed the guide that we're going to introduce you more into, is the UN Women Guide. So it was important for us to discern the meaning of systemic and systematic, to make the distinction between thinking systemically and thinking systematically. So if you look at this, sorry, I'm getting a phone call. I don't know how to cancel it. If you look at this, sorry. If you look at the picture on the left, it's one of my favorite pictures actually. You see a systematic response to a fire. So the firemen hear there's a fire, they come running with their trampoline, and they get in front of the burning building, and they go to save the woman. That's a systematic response, a systematic analysis. If they had thought systemically, they would have realized that there's actually 2 fires happening, and the woman's bounce would actually create more problems than continue to have the same problem, because they hadn't looked at the problem systemically. And so we took that kind of understanding, the fact that you need to think systemically and systematically. So systematic analysis implies a thorough, predictable, and controlled process, which is essentially reproducible, but may not consider all the interactive parts of the system and the stakeholders. So systemic analysis, on the other hand, encourages a critical and holistic analysis of the opportunities, constraints, and relationships, and parts within a system, and analyzing the system as a whole. And we link these concepts in a very important concept in systemic thinking called boundary analysis. And if you see the diagram on the right, you'll see that we took that understanding of systematic and systemic analysis to try and understand the complexity that's represented in the 17 Sustainable Development Goals from the UN that is driving and shaping global development for the next 15 years to 2030. So from 2015 to 2030. So if you think about all of these different 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which every country in the world signed off on, 189 countries approved these 17 goals, then you understand how complex it is to try and understand how they interact with each other. And so that's what our work is directly correlated to. So here's a quote that I'll let you just read on your own. So for us, for systems thinkers, boundary analysis is a thoughtful and ongoing process. It's not something you do just at the beginning or just at the middle or just at the end. It's something you're actually doing ongoing to try and understand what's in and what's out. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. In any intervention you're doing and any evaluation that we're doing. So here's an example of a tool that we use from the guide. It's called the boundary story. So evaluators and systems thinkers basically write up a first order boundary, what we call a first order boundary, and stakeholder analysis of the project to be evaluated. So what that means is that we actually get all the if you're doing an evaluation, for us, it means we get all the documents from the existing project, from the client, in previous evaluations, original scope of work, original goals and objectives, any theories of change. And we look at it and try to understand why was this boundary, why was this boundary and defined and by whom? And it's likely to have a profound and shifting effect on the evaluations and interventions and outcomes. And when we're looking at who got to have input into it, we're also looking at who didn't have to have input into it, and if that's an important thing to consider. What is or was not, we also look at what is or is not included in the boundary story, also affects directly what is or is not evaluated or therefore prioritized. This analysis will therefore be revisited at every subsequent stage. So we just do this ongoing throughout our work. And you can find an example of this, of the tools or the questions you might ask in a guide that we have. So this is just an example of a type of tool that we use in our work. A very essential tool, actually, the boundary story, the boundary analysis. So this is back to you, Anne.
Thanks, Ellen. And a great synopsis of systemic thinking. So where we want to go to next is to think about systemic thinking and inclusion. And we want to introduce to you the GEMS framework. So if you notice that the name of the guide that we wrote is called the ISE for GEMS, so Inclusive Systemic Evaluation for the GEMS framework. These two concepts really work hand in hand, but we will extract out the GEMS framework here and speak a little bit more to its elements, because what we're learning as we're doing more project work is ways to use the GEMS framework as its own discrete intersectional analytical tool in a variety of different projects and concepts and contexts, not just evaluation work. So what is intersectionality? I just want to share this quote with you. Intersectionality has been around for quite some time. We think of it as the way in which a whole range of different social dimensions might intersect, and understanding those intersections is really important to understand inequality and what structures inequality, what contextualizes inequality, what cultural norms and values, and all those things sort of play. And particularly too, where we link it to the ecological crisis that we're living through now. So we regard our work as highly political. It's, you know, it's really not something we can walk away from. And we challenge the dominant Western paradigms to use a more transformative paradigm that is inclusive of diversity in all its forms. So this is kind of a simple graphic. Sorry, I'm on number 15, Ellen, if you're keeping up with me, my human mouse. This is a graphic that depicts the GEMS framework at its sort of most simplistic. You'll see that there's several dimensions to it. There's the gender, environments, and the voices from the margins. These assist us to view oppression as a confluence of forces and unique in context and also in time. So we recognise Kimberly Crenshaw, who was the first to coin the term intersectionality back in 1989. She looked at the triad of gender, race and class in the legal system. And since that time, it has been expanded to include a whole range of other social categories, including sexuality, faith, disability, gender identities, age, location, education, a whole range of different things have been added to her original framework. Also over time, constructivist influences have shifted it from being a bit too rigid and structuralist and even essentialist in character. And that is our contribution too, to abandon any essentialism inherent in its practice. And we do this by trying to reduce the number of preconceived categories that are stated in our framework, to reduce assumptions about the types of oppression that someone from outside of that context might see. And also to try to understand that this is dynamic, it's systemic, and not all forms of discrimination will have equal salience. So it's pretty important, for example, that the word gender is understood from the perspective of people other than Western feminists, because it's contested in many cultures and language. The agenda of Western feminism is to empower women, and the and from oppression of various cultural circumstances. But gender equality is a mainstream concept of UN Women and other developmental multilateral agencies, and it is also cross-cutting across the SDGs. But what if gender oppression is itself the byproduct of Western colonisation? Are we asking minority groups to use the tools of the oppressor to liberate them from their oppression? So I have encountered groups, particularly here in Australia and Central Australia, which are fiercely opposed to gender equality. I can understand why some women would feel deeply conflicted about its goals when it is a construct that's been absolutely, put down upon them. And, one would argue that traditional ways of knowing and being didn't contain a kind of a gendered differentiation in the way that we understand it from the West and from the Western traditions. So our efforts need to be in providing women, girls and non-binary people the space to articulate and voice their experience in their words. And this is a much harder challenge for many reasons. But we start by providing the GEMS framework with its limited words, limited prompts, but broad dimensions in which almost anything that is relevant and appropriate can go.
And a quick note before we go to the next one is that this picture is when we finished some work with the women in Guyana on their work, they got up and sung and danced. And so that somebody happened to capture that picture just as we were wrapping up, 4 days of workshops with them, and they just brought out and sung and danced. So we danced.
And Ellen and I, a little, on the side too, we have our own happy dance. We dance a lot, don't we, Ellen?
We do indeed.
So let's have a look at gender equality and why this is actually in the framework, because it might sound a bit contradictory given what I just said about the contestation of the term. But it was chosen because it encompasses the rich variation of identities, trans and intersex possibilities outside the two very rigidly fixed options of male and female. So we do have a very gender fluid concept of gender. And this dimension takes in every human being on Earth. So as you'll see later on when we talk a bit more about case studies, we don't neglect talking with men. In fact, we actually really encourage that, even when the focus of a project is very clearly on women or women's leadership or women's empowerment or economic livelihoods, whatever it is. In our Western framing, gender attributes and opportunities and relationships are learned and changeable and make a major contribution to the behavioural expectations, differences and inequalities between women and men's responsibilities, activities and access and control of resources and decision making. So, we see all this happening in other contexts. And we have some major treaties and conventions that are meant to help guide our understanding about human justice and human rights, with the Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, ratified in 1979, but it remains an unfulfilled promise that affects all humanity and is at the heart of slowing global human development. And there is a lot of arguments to suggest that because girls don't have the same levels of education as boys and less access to resources across the globe, that that is one of the reasons why the Earth and humankind is in the state that it is in. So I'm on slide 18, human mouth, thank you. Unfortunately, in the field of evaluation, what we see a lot is gender blind evaluation. It's still very commonplace. It is a practice that is not attentive to changes in gender relations, and reports do not make recommendations on gender-related concerns, whether they are from a Western perspective or something grounded from local context. The idea that women's experience is potentially unique and different and needs some kind of elevation is just not present in the report. So what that means is evaluation teams might omit that gendered expertise or research practice. They may fail to gather and analyse data and samples from non-normative participants. So what we strive for is a gender transformative approach that in their words finds ways to relay the experience of all participants from the different starting points of women, men, boys, girls, transgender and intersex people in order to holistically view the gendered effects of policies and programs. So clearly here we're also talking about understanding the power dynamics that underlie gender-based social inequality. Power analysis is cross-cutting across the GEMS. We need to consider power dynamics as that are at play when we analyse the intersections of gender with the other dimensions. So the slide that we have on the screen now around inequity, equality, equity and justice, we put it here because this is both a teaching tool and also an important point of discussion in this whole milieu of work that we are in. Gender equality has a very important discussion point around it, and it's the achievement of equity and social justice as well as gender equality. But, you know, what does each of these look like? What are the various attributes of each goal or ambition? And if by focusing on one, does it take the emphasis off another? And is that detrimental or appropriate? So these debates play out. They play out amongst our own teams. We constantly have debates about the meaning of words and terminologies. Often those are not purely settled, and perhaps they never will be, because I think they represent a lot of tensions that exist in social discourse and social theory. But nonetheless, we still work with all these terms where it is appropriate to do so. And ultimately, we're working towards a human rights-based agenda. So I'm going to hand over to Ellen in a moment. I just want to finish this little section by talking about one of our case studies that we did recently, just to highlight the gender dimension of the GEMS. It was a project we did looking at efforts on ameliorating or eliminating violence against women and children in Timor Leste, and was commissioned by World Vision. And it was an interesting project to me, but I've done a lot of work in violence prevention, and I see a lot of efforts focused very much on the safety of women, sometimes girls. Girls are often, or children are often referred to as the children of women who might be experiencing the violence. So if you do a boundary analysis of this, there's not much that's in, and there's a lot that's outside the boundary. And yet violence against women is a social problem that every single person should be a part of. So I really commended World Vision for thinking about this in a more systemic and inclusive way. We were asked very particularly to look at women and girls living with disability and the impact of violence against them. Older women, as well as divorced, widowed and abandoned women, which is a whole category of women who are particularly marginalised in Timor-Leste society. Children in schools experience terrible violence from teachers. Unfortunately, some of the stories are quite shocking. It has been made in legal practice to physically reprimand children for misbehaviour, but a lot of teachers are struggling to understand how they can do behaviour management in classrooms without physical assault. So that was a major part of this project. And it also included consideration of LGBTI communities, which representation is low in Timor-Leste because there's underreporting. It's still a country that has a lot of social taboos around those concepts, but nonetheless we were asked to look for and find. So it was a really interesting way of seeing our gender dimension in all its glory. Ellen, over to you.
Great. So now we're going to talk about the E in the GEMS. So the environment is a catch-all term for the social ecological systems, the ecosystems and ecological environmental landscapes, both human-made and natural landscapes and systems. It helps establish a really deep contextual understanding of the place. The environment dimension of the GEMS requires a constant attention to the boundary of the system in focus. Consideration of this context will need to include other intersecting factors such as analysis of a post-conflict settings, a humanitarian crises, faith-based influences, or organizational constraints. This added analysis helps to contextualize a project to better understand its coherence and relevance to the other GEMS dimensions. And we should note also that when we do these analysis, we always work in partnership with local people, for people from the country who actually have a lived experience. So it's not these external people from the global north. It's actually done in partnership to help us understand what is the context and what are the dimensions that, and how are they defined locally. It also supports practitioners identify and analyze power patterns between humans and human societies, as well as other life forms on Earth. Nature is perceived as something much more than an object for human manipulation, but as a subject that deserves recognition and respect, although the ISC for GEMS did not feminize this concept. It means thinking about the environment as a marginalized stakeholder, lacking voice and diminished by its non-human status. Also, environmental health and habitability of a place as the physical capacity of a social ecological system to support life. Perhaps it sounds contradictory, but the first lens is gender equality, chosen because it encompasses the rich variations of identities. And this dimension takes into consideration every human being on Earth. In our Western framing, gender attributes, opportunities, and relationships are learned and changeable and make a major contribution to the behavioral expectations, the differences, and inequalities between women's and men's responsibilities, activities, access, and control of resources. So this is just, the environment is a broad scope that includes not only natural environment, but contextual environment. So in practice, we also draw on knowledge. This is a colleague of ours, Monica Gagliano, who has published a really interesting book. We draw, in practice, we draw from the knowledge, skills, and expertise of transdisciplinary and traditional scientists, so such as local indigenous or place-based occupants, sustainability science, and decision makers. And for this dimension, evidence-based science on the cognition of plants, this is Monica's work, has to influence our ethical approach to environmental decision making. So this Italian scientist, Monica Gagliano, and colleagues have produced some really interesting work, has produced cutting edge research on the cognitive behaviors of plants. Laboratory experiments reveal that plant behaviors, including perception, learning, memorization, decision-making, and interspecies communications. Dr. Gagliano is building a case for a serious consideration of the agency of plants. The environmental dimension in GEMS frame encourages us all to take advantages in biological sciences seriously. So this is a case study that was based in it was the same program developed in 3 different countries. So looking to see how different cultures reacted to different, to the same type of goals and theories of change. This had the intersections of the environment, the history and political context of place, women in focus, and also in their communities, children, families. And it was important to be inclusive of men in this project, even though the evaluation was about women's leadership and participation. It reflected a major shift in development work in this last several decades, from women in development to gender and development. And for me, I have to say, this has been one of the most effective programs I have seen as far as really driving social change as a primary goal and outcome. Increasing gender equality, it increased food security, it lowered conflict, it increased disaster preparedness, and it changed behaviors around climate change adaptation, all within like a 2-year project. So the third dimension of the GEMS framework is called marginalized voices. Originally, it was called Voices from the Margin in Anne's work, which includes human and non-human voices. That means marginalization could be, for example, youth or pensioners, things that we normally think of marginalized voices in a society, but it also could include a language or a culture or an idea. We found in the work that we did in Guatemala, for example, that both the language and the culture of the indigenous populations, the women that we worked with felt that the positive outcomes of the program, which is to increase their capability to do backstrap weaving, continue to develop their cultural art and sustain their family financially, and also get their children educated, was also taking away from the language and their culture, because their children, once they went away to school, really felt a little bit disassociated with their original indigenous culture that they were born into. So there's always trade-offs when you do interventions and development work. So this dimension, the M dimension, the marginalized dimension, might apply to any phenomena leading to marginalization or discriminatory practice that lessen human dignity, their rights, and opportunity for people and non-humans to thrive. Again, we encourage practitioners to seek the voices of marginalized, but not from a preconceived category, defined notion of who these people might be or what their perspectives might be. Rather, difference, marginalization, and oppression understood as they define it. It is their work to help us understand what their lived experience is. So I'll hand this over to Anne now.
Yeah, I'll jump in and explain the case study for this dimension, because this one might capture it quite well. We mentioned that a lot of our work has a focus on gender, primarily being women, and so it's when you go through the all the different projects that we've done, I was really thinking, where's one that actually doesn't focus on women first? And this one is one such project, where the project was to develop a systemic theory of change for early childhood education sector. So the NGO had a number of different programs they were doing for early childhood learning and development. And what they found was that they hadn't consulted at the grassroots levels. They hadn't brought organisations, people from organisations locally on board. And in this particular culture, they had been accustomed and had drawn some expectations around NGOs, both providing funding and providing all the operational essentials of a service. So, they sort of, I wouldn't say sit back and let it happen, but that is how they've been conditioned in some respects. So this NGO had neglected local participation for far too long, and their model was failing terribly, and they were set back in their plans to roll out early childhood learning centres across the country. So they need a new strategy, and they started with a new theory of change on how change will occur, on what is needed. So we ran a series of grass level workshops to design a systemic theory of change from the ground up, prioritising the voices of parents, particularly mothers, and their children, although the children age group was 1 to 5, so it wasn't easy to do any work with little kids. But nonetheless, they were prioritised, their voices, their views were prioritised over government agents, politicians, the members of society who have authority and voice, often male. And we were working in a society that was deeply hierarchical and very patriarchal in nature. So it was a really great project, and the real question was, well, how do we take the NGO out of the picture and give it back to community? So Ellen, slide 27.
Right, we're on it. It's Burton's quote.
It is. These redefinitions of ethical principles are rich with possibilities to stimulate thinking about the meaning of ethics. And I just love this quote. We see the GEMS pushing boundaries of ethical practice when working with communities in the global south from our positions in the global north. And it is our 10-year plan to make ourselves redundant from ethos of engagement. We want to shift the power. We want to help build the capacity. We want to be there with people who are doing great work on their own terms. So we've got a last couple of slides. The slide 28, we discussed how do we use this with you, with this audience, and what we came up with was just to show these two pictures, and rather than do the activities, just to explain, when we're thinking about systems thinking, we use these as teaching resources for people who are novices and being introduced to systems thinking. Ellen, do you want to describe how we run those activities a bit more?
Sure. So what we did, I mean, what I tend to do when I go into any new country is I take pictures. So I can really understand the culture, but also I want to be able to use some of the pictures in any presentation that I ultimately do with the country so that they have some kind of relational to the concept. So I take pictures of the local country. And this is one of the things I did when I was in Nicaragua. I asked each gentleman if I could take a picture of them. And I used this with the young people that I was training as facilitators in my PhD project. I worked with young people to deliver the workshops that I had spoken of. And so I had them identify something that they see all the time, which is a horse and cart in Nicaragua, and identify the gems in this picture. So if they looked at the gender, they see it was men. Of course, they said, and so conversation was, is it always men that have to drive a horse and cart? Or is there another time when women might use a horse and cart? And they said, oh yeah, and they do. So they had a conversation about that. The environment was the slabs of wood that was being taken away and harvested. And then the marginalized voice was the horse. The horse is a voice that the horse is being used for transportation and for also not mostly for transportation and for economic development for them. But you know, who represents the horse? At what point does the horse's voice get included in what is good for the horse overall, and how does that voice get heard, and what might that be? So that was a really interesting conversation for people, and they could really immediately relate with the picture because it looked so familiar to them because it was from their culture. The one on the right is a picture where we asked the same question: identify the gems. Where can you see gender? You see groups of men talking here on the right. You see groups of women carrying, looks like water on their heads. And then you see, and then you ask what the environment is. You can say, well, there's a tree there. But there's also the water, the environment. You're asking, where's that water coming from? Where's that water, and how often do they have to go to it to go get it? So the environment's represented there. And then the marginalized voices can be the water, it can be the tree, it can be the young person that you see, the child that you see being carried in with their hand being held. So it's really gets people to look at that complexity that is real in everyday life, that you can't just look, if the men are discussing how to bring water, how to get water to the village, then there has to be all these different complexities represented in the conversation. And yet in this picture, which actually came from an Ethiopian colleague, that men often do make decisions for that need to be considered broader than their own input, but it needs to be a more collective, a gender inclusive conversation. So that's it. The things that we want to close with, and then we're open to all questions, is, are there ways that inclusive systemic thinking might be used in your work or life? What are the key lessons you can take from these examples that we've given you? And do you have lessons to share with us that can help improve our practice? We are always open to new collaborations and new learnings from whatever field that is interested in working with us. So we're always looking to have that collaborative nature of co-learning across transdisciplinary. So thank you so much for having us, and we're now open for questions and answers. I'll stop sharing.
And thanks both Ellen and Anne for that presentation. If other people can feel free, raise your hand, and I'll invite you to speak, or add questions to the chat and I can ask them. And while people are thinking of a quick question or any of those reflections that were on the slides, I was just going to ask, it might be a bit of a big question, but yeah, because you're all about that sort of inclusive part, so and making sure that it's reflective, how do you personally, when you're coming in to do this piece of work, ensure that you're reaching everyone that needs to be part of that system to be involved?
Anne, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. We have some processes embedded in the ISE for GEMS guidance on this. One of them is steps around doing stakeholder analysis and vulnerability assessments. So we make it an explicit practice to try to understand the full context of the work through the boundary story and all the people that may or may not be impacted, or they may be impacted, but are they outside the boundary of the evaluation? So there's a lot of sort of very deliberate effort to think about who and under what situation, what context they're involved as much as possible. I think the second part of that question too is addressed by the fact that we don't do the work. We always have in-country teams, people who speak the language, people who come from the localities or familiar with the context, local cultures, the language, the religion. They may be related to people in the villages. There's all that sort of embeddedness as well, which is certainly insider knowledge that would be very, very difficult for, if it was me arriving in a new country, to ascertain. And I'd add that I think that's one of the real advantages that our little businesses had post-COVID, is that managing projects remotely like we do has become the new best practice in this area, which is pre-COVID. It was you would be paying more money for projects to be done because there would be an insistence on people like Ellen and I going to the country and doing the field work ourselves. And we've proven that that's not necessary, and I think it's a much better model that we've got now. Anything to add on that, Ellen?
No, I think it's just always being reflective about who's in and who's out and why. It's like it's that boundary analysis, right? So constantly knowing that a boundary is a dotted line, and that at some point you do decide, okay, this is the focus of this is who we're going to have in the project and who's going to be interviewed, because at some point either time constraints or financial constraints make you have to create some kind of, this is what we're going to analyze. But we're always reflective, self-reflective, and we're also create an atmosphere with our teams that their wisdom is as important as our wisdom. We all bring different things to the table, so we work very transparently and very collaboratively with our teams.
Yeah, thanks both. Yeah, crucial point there about having the people who live there, who know it, being part of that team. Great. Ruth, you've got a question.
Yeah, thanks very much, both of you. Thanks for the double act. You gave 3 really interesting case studies, but obviously reasons of time, you could only skate over the details. So I was just wondering, so the Timor Leste, for example, is what actually happened on the outputs of your work that was different, that wouldn't have happened? So not, I sort of think I've got the idea of what you did. But what was the outcome that was really different because of what you did?
Is this the Violence Against Women project in Timor-Leste, Ruth?
That's right. Yeah. And you said there are lots of initiatives on this which have got, the boundaries have been very tight, lots of people excluded.
Look, it was an evaluation, so it was an end stage evaluation.
Okay,
Phase
right.
1. And when I first approached it, I was actually veering towards making a recommendation that it ought not to be refunded, but the donors refunded it without the evaluation being produced. So we had to provide some very pragmatic recommendations to really help them steer the project in phase 2 towards the outcomes that they really were desiring. We found, look, I commended world vision. I think that for an organisation working in a Catholic country as constrained as it is through its normative values, they were doing tremendous cutting edge work. They still had a lot to do, and I was only speaking to them this week. The recommendations that we provided, they're working through them. They're redesigning their program in response to them. They're really enthusiastic and excited about doing that. So it was one of those exercises where I learned that speaking truth to power really can pay off.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions before we finish? Ruth, just a point for you. People are saying the link you put in the chat isn't working. So if you've got another link, or if Karen has, that would be great. For us.
Right. It promised. Yes, I don't know. So maybe we have to send it round afterwards.
So just as a final note from us, please take our invitation to be in touch with us, to ask us questions that you didn't feel comfortable asking online. We are very transparent and open to all collaborations. And when we say that, we actually get opportunities to work in areas that we hadn't considered as something that we would work in, because we hadn't crossed our minds. So that's why working collaboratively is so important for us. So please do reach out if there's some collaboration, either research-based or evaluation-based or organization development-based, that might be something you'd like some support on.
Most definitely. We're very open, very friendly, very approachable. Please be in touch.
There she is. You can see Anne for a nanosecond.
I know, exact. It's stable.
Yay. That's because it's 11 o'clock at night at your house.
Yeah, the neighbours have stopped streaming stuff on Netflix and given me my bandwidth.
Yeah, she gets her bandwidth back about this time.
Thanks. Just in time.
Yeah. And just I've reposted the link, and it seems to be getting better. I probably had too many words.
Thanks very much.
Can I also say, just echoing that comment from Ellen and Anne, they're going to be on a different time zone between them, and they're really responsive in sort of sorting things out between them. Very impressive.
Thanks, Ruth.
Thanks for inviting us. We're very pleased, and we're very excited actually about the expansion of systems thinking strand in the OR conferences. That's really started to pick up, and we're just excited about that. So, yay! Systems thinkers are coming to help support, to collaborate.
Great. Well, I can't see any other questions, but yeah, please do take up Ellen and Anne's offer if you have any other questions to direct to them by email. And I will close the session by saying thank you very much again to our speakers. Thanks to the WORAN Events Committee, chaired by Ruth, for organising this event. Thanks to you all for attending, and I hope to see you at our next event in February. But yeah, enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Good night.
You.
Or have a lovely day.
Have a nice sleep.